kind of give you the quick on ULI as well. So I know we have some folks not only from Orange County and City of Orlando, but we have some folks from other counties and municipalities. And like always, it never fails, technical issues is the first thing right off the bat that becomes the issue. So we are going to get, let me just tell you, we'll go on. You always press on. Welcome. ULI is a 40,000 member organization globally, 25 here in Central Florida. The local chapter here in Central Florida is a 14 county. A lot of times people think it's only about Orange County, Osceola County, Seminole, but we go to either side, to Lake, all the way to Brevard, Volusia. We have about 360, 380 members here locally, and there's always an opportunity for some of you. If you're interested in joining us, please talk to one of us, part of the team. Our mission is providing leadership in the use of land and creating sustainable communities and thriving communities as well. We're a 501c3. We don't necessarily advocate for or lobby, but we do advocate for issues. We're about education. We're about bringing a global organization, bringing the resources of that global organization here locally, so we can act on those things and we can use those and we can create a more thriving community for everybody involved. And we do a lot of, ULI does a lot of nonpartisan research and education. The database now for Knowledge Finder is immense. There's case studies. You can download a case study very similar to this technical assistance panel and that address topics across each of the pillars or the sectors that ULI is kind of built upon. The technical assistance panel is what has been going on here today. So we may refer to it as a TAP. And throughout the day, or at least the day. You're only here for an hour, not to scare you. But it is coordinated and implemented here. This is an issue that is nationally. Attainable housing, affordable housing, this is an issue that we've been thinking about here locally as well. And I'll recognize Becky Wilson was the past chair, and Becky started this process with a lot of different people through the TAP, and it just kind of fell in on a little bit of my shoulders, but really more so a lot of the people that will be introduced here later. And what a great time, because this TAP is right on the heels, or actually in the fourth step of what the county is starting to do with their Housing for All initiative, and they will be making some recommendations moving forward to that come the next couple of weeks. So this is a 2 days of study and analysis. There will be information that you see up here. Then have been working drawings for people that have been involved, or professionals, nonpartisan, multidiscipline. We've had individuals from the banking industry, the lending institutions, the design professionals, the contractors, developers that are actually trying to build this type of product. And so it's across the boards, across the spectrum of the development services. And we have a lot of market voices that have been plugged in to the analysis of this today. The preliminary findings that you will see throughout the day is what we're a culmination of here today. For this next hour, you're going to hear some of those findings. And the final report, it says 6 weeks it will be delivered, but really we hope to get that out in a little bit more. So if you signed in and you provided your email address, we will get that personally out to you. And then Kelly is our executive director here locally. She put immediately an assignment for us to have a meeting tomorrow to figure out what the next steps, how we can plug in locally, how we can take this data, we can continue to build upon this through the next coming weeks. So if you're interested, I've already started to wrangle a couple of people that said they were interested. So how do we take this initiative? How more importantly do we take it and we follow up on it on a regular basis throughout the next year as well? Again, just lastly, thank you for being here. This is not only Orlando, Orange County. We have a great opportunity. We are a community that is driven by tourism, and the housing attainability are different for them than for building a sustainable and thriving downtown community. We have one of the best universities in all of the country with probably the second highest population. So again, diversity and attainable housing can be applied to that. We have some great factors that we can apply here. So this timing and this TAP is critically important for us locally. So with that, I'm going to pass it off to Ken. Ken is the ringmaster, the taskmaster, the brain trust behind this group today. So Ken.
Thank you, Scott, and thank you to Orlando and Greater Orlando for giving us the opportunity to come in, talk about this opportunity with you, review this, tap your local talent, tap some national experts around this. And I'm just privileged to have been a bit of a guide to this really group of smart people that's come together to help you with this. And with that, I really want to introduce our panelists. You can see their names listed here, but what I'd like to do is to ask them to just stand up one by one, introduce themselves, what organization they're with, and where they live. So maybe starting over here.
So I'm Charles Adams. I head up the development management services for a company called VHB. I have just returned to Orlando after being gone for 20 years, and it's kind of like coming home.
Good morning, my name is Tyler Johnson. I'm a planner with Charles at VHB, and I live and work right here in downtown Orlando.
We're Charlotte with Charlotte Rock Associates, architects here in town. This is my hometown.
Other TAP members?
Good morning, everyone. My name is Dean Grandin, formerly planning director of the City of Orlando. Now retired, but I'm delighted to be in the mix, and I'm glad to be here.
After you, Bill, after you.
I'm Mike Frumpkin. I'm the former Dean of the College of Health and Public Affairs at UCF, and since 2008, we've lived in Winter Springs.
Hi, I'm Greg Logan. I'm Managing Director of Arcioco, and I'm based here in Orlando.
Jim Carr, been in the Orlando area for 50 years, in the real estate business and land entitlements.
I'm Jeff Robbins. I'm with Related Development here in Central Florida. Been in Central Florida since the mid-'80s.
Keith Lowe with Advent Health.
Aaron Smith with Bank of America and Community Development Corporation. I am from Charlotte, North Carolina.
I'm Albert Arzuaga, Director of Real Estate and Asset Management for the Orlando Neighborhood Improvement Corporation, a local affordable housing developer. I live in Avalon Park. I'm originally from Puerto Rico.
I'm Tiffany Manuel, President and CEO of The Case Made, which is an organization that helps build public will around some of these issues, and I'm a recent transplant to Orlando, and I live here.
And I'm Ken Stapleton, as chair of this technical advisory panel. I'm an urban economic development consultant out of Miami and Cincinnati, and I also work for the University of Cincinnati in their Office of Innovation. Along with the official TAP members, this is a pretty unique thing for a technical advisory panel or TAP. We've had a whole series of people who are listed here who participated actively in these discussions and even in advance of these discussions, and so we want to recognize them as well. So if you would, just join me in giving this whole group and team of people a round of applause, because they will tell you that they worked really hard over the last day and a half, and it was not a surprise to me that several of them came in this morning and said, I really didn't sleep well, Ken, because I woke up at 3, or I was still up at 3, thinking this through, trying to understand what we need to do next, and everything else. And that is typical of the kind of commitment that we get out of ULI members and others when we do these kinds of panels. And so I want you to really appreciate that this was an all-in, flat-out sprint for a day and a half to really get after how we can be helpful to the community around us. And so with that, I want to hand this back over to Tiffany, who's going to kind of explain to us why we're here and why it's important that we have this conversation. And yes, happy to give you that.
Well, good morning. So it's my role this morning to just help us to understand the context of the work that we're going to present to you today. First of all, let me just start with what you already know, hopefully, which is Orlando is a great place to live, work, and play, right? We have some of the best neighborhoods in the country. In fact, there are many of the builders and architects and folks and planners right here in the audience today who have done award-winning work in this community. And there's some of the most beautiful communities across the country. We have that in Orlando. In addition to that, some of the most interesting community building, farmers markets, places for folks to do community gardens, amazing places to build community in Orlando. In addition to that, great schools, right? And not only great schools, but I think also diverse schools, right? We've got diverse groups of folks, not just from the United States, but all over the world. Not just from sort of cradle, right, all the way to high school, but all the way through college. In fact, we're sitting here at UCF campus right here, some of the best schools in the nation. And guess what? A thriving economy, right? A lot of the folks who own businesses in this region are hiring, right? This is not a place where we're struggling to figure out how to get jobs for folks, right? There are a lot of folks who are hiring in this region, which is fantastic. So stop, don't just take our word for it. This is a great place. 75 million people came here last year for a variety of reasons, another record-breaking year for a variety of reasons, and that is up consistently. So consistently, we're bringing more and more people to the region to enjoy all the things that we now think about when we think about Orlando. In addition to that, job growth is strong, not just in each quarter, but the prospects, long-term economic prospects for Orlando and for Central Florida are enormous, right? So we know this is a region that is growing and thriving. In addition to that, it's great that we live here, but we also know that we have to protect what we have here. It's a great place to live, work, and play, but if we're not addressing some of these issues of affordable housing and issues of housing overall, we're going to lose that. Right, we're going to lose the very thing that many people came here, right, to find, or that many people have grown up in. And so part of our task today is to say, how do we maintain the great standard of living that has now become Orlando? So we will say, if we look further out, just a little while ago, earlier in the year, some of the Orlando leaders here did a study around economic development and the economics of regional prosperity prospects. And what they found was that by 2030, we're going to have about 5.2 million additional people living in this region, right? Adding about 1,500 people per week to this region. Already some are saying that can be a challenge, right? If housing is already something that's challenging for us and we're adding new people, we got to think this thing through. We got to make sure that we're planning for the future that we want for Orlando, and that's a part of the reason we brought you here today. So we got 2 tomorrows in front of us, right? One tomorrow is we don't take any action, right? We let the sort of the economic forces emerge as they might. And in 10 years, in 2030, when you look at all those different people, we'll be having this conversation, talking about how do we fix the crisis, right? And when you look across the nation at those places who did not get in front of this kind of economic boom, right, this is what's happened. 10 cities, you look at Seattle and San Francisco, they've got great economies, they're making so much money. It's fantastic, and yet you walk outside and you have to step over people just to get to work or just to get to the grocery store. We don't want that. We think it's possible in Orlando to have enormous growth and at the same time have livable communities. So we want to think about how we plan for our future. That's what this exercise was about. How do we plan for the needs that we know are here today and the tomorrow that we want that's livable for the region? So we got good news and bad news for you. I would say which one we want first, but I'm going to give you the bad news first. How about that? So the bad news is this is not just an issue of low-income families. Affordable housing is usually about 0 to 80% of area median income. So it's folks who may have no income all the way up to about $40,000, right? That's affordable. There are a lot of folks in this region who are working on the affordable side of this. That's usually the part where there's a lot of government intervention because there's a lot of need in that, and not all of it is for folks who have an income, right? It's not much you can do, or it's more challenging for folks who don't have an income. It would be easy to some extent if we could sort of narrow it down to that and be done with it, but it's not. There are a lot of folks who are in what we would call sort of middle income jobs. They're police officers, they're teachers, they're social workers, they're business startups, right? They're university professors, probably some of the university professors here at this university, who are struggling to find a decent place to live in Orlando. So to some extent, the bad news is it's not just that sort of 0 to 80%, it's all the way out to those folks who even are working, the kind of jobs that are professional but still challenging. Median income in this region, Orlando's $55,000. What we're saying, attainable housing, about 0 to 120% of area median income is about $45,000 to $60,000. So you can think about the kinds of folks who make that much money. The industry definition for that, right, what it means to have attainable housing with that missing middle, right, is 0 to about 120% of the area median income, as the way we defined it above that. But I will say that we came together in this conversation and really wanted to think about a broader range of folks, that really 80% of area median income, all the way out to about 150% of area median income. So we have a slightly sort of broader range, but what I hope you'll see is that we're really focused on this part of the market that needs housing, but it's not being served. So we will also say that we did not just simply think about this in general terms. We had consultants working with us to develop some database models around this. This is a chart of the folks who are both on the left side of this, the sort of light orange bars are those folks who are homeowners in Orange County already, and the right side of orange, the darker orange, are folks who are active buyers who would love to own a home in that middle income range in Orlando. And what you see is there are a couple of bars where there's specifically really big gaps: young professionals, young families, and intermediate families. So we know that those are not the only folks, obviously, in this sort of attainable housing space that need a place to live, but those are places where we know that there are really big gaps between the two. So you find that some of our energy really went to thinking specifically about those groups, even though, of course, the entire range is something that we care about. So I'm going to wrap up my part of this conversation, this sort of context piece, by saying the good news. I gave you the bad news. Right, let me give you some of the good news. The good news is, from my vantage point, and I think many of my panelist colleagues will share this sentiment as well, we have a big opportunity to get in front of this. Right? Lots of cities are dealing with affordable housing issues and attainable housing issues, but they don't have an economy that looks as strong as ours. They don't have a workforce that looks as strong as ours. They don't have world-class universities, right, in the same way that we do. Right? They don't have great schools in a way that they don't have, right, essentially the foundation that we have to really get in front of this. Right? They're struggling to bring those things along, and they're also trying to figure out housing. We're in a moment where, if we think about what's happening in Orlando, for us really to get in front of some of this stuff, to plan for the future that's livable for a whole range of folks, for a diverse range of folks who need and want to live in this community. So that's the context and the spirit in which we engaged over the last 2 days in these conversations. What's the opportunity for us really to meet the need and have the future that we know is prosperous? So I'll stop there and hand it back over to my colleague. Thank you.
Thank you, Tiffany. So she hit on something that I want to repeat, and she did a little bit indirectly, but I want to do it directly. And that is, congratulations for actually bringing a group together to talk about this. Congratulations for having the leadership to elevate this concern and this opportunity to a point where you're ready to take action around it. And we realize that this TAP is not the only thing that's going on in the region around this topic. And I think I spent a good part of my time in Miami, and I will tell you, and I'm very involved in the ULI District Council in Miami, we have not elevated this conversation the way that you have. So congratulations, and I think it takes good leadership and some really good strategic thinking to get you there. But as the team, and really this is, I'm just the mouthpiece up here, the team did all the work on this, right? As the team thought about this, several themes emerged in terms of what you need to do to get ahead of it, as Tiffany mentioned. Number one, build more efficiency and innovation into the housing delivery system. Two, unlock capital for this part of the market and work to develop a streamlined approach to tapping that capital. I mean, capital is cash, right? Elevate leadership and visibility on this issue. You've started down that path, but we actually think probably thematically there's more to be done, and there's bigger and better conversations to have around this. And then finally, in terms of the industry, work to build that capacity of developers, builders, architects, planners, and even others, including mobility planners and things like that can help you get after this idea that we want people in all ranges to have decent places. They are critically important to our economy, and we want to really get after this particular issue. So those are the themes. I think that's a slide that got left in if it wasn't supposed to be. Okay, yeah, you skip that one. So with that, we have the real experts ready to talk to you about the draft recommendation. So if you have been paying attention to anything so far, which is fine, except for what Tiffany said, this is where you really, really want to get out your pens and pencils and take some good notes, because we've got a great team that's going to come up here and share with you their top priorities. By the way, this was hard to do. Their top priorities for what they think is really important to get after next. And then we'll have a little bit of wrap up after they present. So try to remember who's up first. Thank you.
Yeah, sure. Go to the next slide to confirm. Good morning. So some of the topics I'm going to hit on will be touched in with some of the other groups. This really is a comprehensive issue. A lot of things really have to come together. But the first, let me take a step back. These recommendations are really focused on income and mobility. And income is not necessarily what the income is. It's income earning potential. It's improving the income of the residents who need this attainable housing. And the mobility options are not just, can you bike, are there bike lanes, but it's how the costs that people spend on their transportation needs affect the attainability of their housing. So the first recommendation is to reduce barriers to accessory uses. This includes accessory dwelling units to supplement income and reduce financial burdens. And I just want to say, there is some really good work already going on here regionally. You don't have to look outside of Central Florida to look for some examples. Orange County, in their latest update, clarifying that ADUs don't count towards density. The city of Orlando, if it's less than 500 square feet, you can get it. You don't have to hit the same transportation and school impact fees and all that reduces development, but providing this housing that's really needed to some of these young professionals especially. But also, this adds, accessory dwelling units can add a revenue stream to the owner of the building. If they can rent it out to one of these people that need attainable housing, that's a monthly income stream that they can get. If it's an Airbnb type deal where they can, rent it out to people coming to visit Orlando and all those tourists that come and support our economy, that's a great option. And finally, one of the things we talked about a lot was the multi-generational housing. Kids moving back in with their parents, parents moving in with their kids, and the opportunities that provides with these ADUs, and especially, one of the costs that we talked about was childcare costs. And if you have a parent living, in an accessory unit, reducing your monthly cost for childcare is another option. And finally, it's not just living units; it's the live-work units that we talk about, and having flexible units that can have residential on the first floor when that might be what the market demands. We can have commercial or office space on the first floor when that's what the market demands, and making sure that whoever owns the unit can actually rent that out if they're not going to use it as another income stream. And once again, I said there's some good work already being done here in Central Florida, but like Scott said, we're 14 counties for the ULI Central Florida. It's not just Orlando. It's we're serving the population in a wide range of areas. The second recommendation is to seek opportunities to partner with corporate entities and provide education and training for residents to enhance their economic mobility and stability. So really, how do you work to improve the economic situations of these folks in attainable housing? One of the examples that we looked at was in Jersey City, and it was a multifamily unit, and they had for their residents a financial literacy course. Okay, now you own a home, how do you maintain that home? How do you make sure that you can stay in that home? And it was so successful for the residents, it became a community-wide program. I mean, other organizations were coming in to this program to help teach other folks in the community these things. And what can we do to really help, in these areas that we design, in these new communities or in infill communities, to really help bring these spaces in? As a planner and designer, we're always looking at, creating community space, creating these facilities, but really it's the programming behind it. What programs are you bringing in? Who are your partners to help support these kind of services that can help improve the lives and the economic situation of the folks who live in these attainable housing. Next is to promote, create, and retain attainable housing near transit stops and employment centers. This really speaks to the mobility aspect, the transportation aspect, how people get places, and this is really focused on allowing all of the residents of the community to access all the opportunities that a community have. You don't necessarily have to sit on 408 or I-4 for an hour to get to your work. You can live and work close to the same area and really focus on some target. This is more a location looking at a targeted area. Atlanta was an example we talked about where they specified, they had a number, they said 5,600 units in targeted areas around the Beltline. And so that's their goal and that's what they're working to strive towards. But the other side is, how do you make sure that those units are retained and they stay attainable housing, and it's not someone comes in, buys it, and 2 years later they sell it at market rate and that is no longer an attainable housing on the market. Community land trust is an option that we talked about, I think that we'll touch on a little bit more. An example out in Boulder was exactly that. It was this great little community, had all sorts of product type, and there was restrictions on how much you could resell the house for each year. So what they were doing was really making sure that what was built as attainable and intended to be attainable maintained, or stayed attainable. And finally, to reconsider the continuously evolving transportation needs and options of residents. I don't want to get into how the transportation market's changing. We all know that's changing. But just to touch on, rideshare, Uber, Lyft, all those things, how does that affect what we're looking at? Reducing parking standards, obviously, is something that I think we'll talk about. But also in Gainesville, for instance, they're now have requirements for scooter parking and bike parking, and what that allows you to do is reduce the required parking demand, so you're not building as many parking spaces, you can build more units, and you're not spending as much capital on the parking side of things. You can spend it on housing. And with this, the final kind of option I wanted to just touch on is rethinking how parking is part of an apartment. If we're looking at these areas with employment centers where people may not have cars anymore because they use rideshare or they bike, separating out the parking from the housing cost, almost as an a la carte type menu where you're buying an apartment and you're like, I need 1 parking space, or I need 2 parking spaces, or I don't need a parking space. If you're talking about a parking deck and you're talking $50,000 for 2 spaces, well, if we're looking at $200,000 homes, that's 25% of the cost just on parking that you may not need, and how we can start kind of separating out what the consumer actually is demanding and what they need versus what's being provided. I think with that, I'll pass it off to the next group.
Okay. Who's up next?
That's me. Good morning, everybody. You will probably hear a lot of duplication, replication of efforts as we go through this, because there are a lot of common themes. And as one of the developers in the crowd, one of the things we tried to bring to the table was a sense of practicality to some of these design concepts and some of these ideas. So I hope that hopefully this will embrace some of these. The first thing we talked about is the reevaluation of the land development regulations to encourage the attainable housing. There's a lot of facets to that. One of the things we talked about was impact fee regulations and its impact on development costs. Obviously, if a single family house has an impact fee of, let's just say arbitrarily $10,000, that doesn't matter whether it's a 1,000 square foot unit or a 5,000 square foot unit. We think that the impact to the overall community and providing some relief for those seeking attainable housing on those lower end units, those smaller units, we think is a good idea. And instead of basing it on a per unit basis, maybe we should look at it on a value basis or on a square footage basis of the unit, which would obviously be a lot more attainable. We also thought about the timing of those fees. As a developer, I can tell you that oftentimes when we go in and develop a project, many times our impact fees are several $1 million and oftentimes are required at the time of the building permit. If we just stop and think about the timing of those payments relative to the receiving of the cash flows from the development standpoint, when the units are ultimately turned over to the residents, floating that capital for your equity and your debt capital stack structure is awfully expensive. So one of the things we proposed was to go in and make the payment of those impact fees timing with when the residents actually take occupancy of the unit, which ultimately that's when the impact of the community, whether it's transportation, whether it's the schools, the water, the sewers, the parks, the recreation, that's ultimately when the impact is made anyway, which we think that would be very advantageous in helping hold down some of those development costs. Another one of the things we thought about was the alternative design standards. The design standards between single family, duplex, triplex, and then getting into the quadruplex, that change between the 3-unit or the 4-unit and above in terms of density, there's an awful lot of requirements that mandate expensive additions to the drawings, to the process, the construction of the development process. So we think that there ought to be a set of design standards where we can create some flexibilities for those units that are single, duplex, and triplex. Another one of the things we thought about was accessory dwelling units. And we used the example, there's a part of the community, Pine Hills, that was developed many years ago. It's a great little working class neighborhood, but a lot of those single family homes were 1,400 square feet, but they were built on lots that were oftentimes 80 feet wide by 120 feet deep. There's a tremendous opportunity there to allow these additional or these auxiliary dwelling units to be co-developed on these sites. We don't need to have an 80 by 120 lot sustaining one single family house. So the opportunity to create enhanced income for residents where they can go in and create these ADUs and create revenue sources or potential multi-generational dwelling units for grandma, grandpa, mom and dad as they start to age. We think that's a tremendous asset and certainly ought to be considered as well. One of the things we thought about was making the lot splits a development right. One of the things that I'm accustomed to going in and going before city councils and government agencies, and I've got a whole staff of people's attorneys, land use folks that I use to go and to represent me, but a lot of people don't have that opportunity. So we think that there ought to be an attainable set of rights that particular landowner has to go in and buy, and by right, they're able to go in, make the permitting process, and not have to go through the public hearing process. We think that's it's terribly expensive to do, it's time constraining, and also it's very expensive. So we think, and all of these things brought together, we think enhance the affordability and the desirability, if you will, of attracting capital for attainable housing. Another one of the things we thought about were parking requirements. We alluded to that earlier. The parking environment is changing, it's changing overnight. I can tell you in the projects that we're working on right now, oftentimes I'm required to develop upwards 1.75, even 2 units per acre, or 2 spaces per unit on my parking. If I'm doing structured parking, it's $18,000 to $25,000 a unit. We got to start thinking outside the box. We're getting less cars. There's ride sharing opportunities. We talked about scooters and other modes of transportation. We need to start considering that. We as developers are not going to underpark our communities. If we do, it's obviously adversarial. It's detrimental to our overall retainership of our tenants. So we're going to develop. So we need flexibility in those parking requirements to allow people to think outside the box. And as the market evolves on parking, we don't need to have a one-size-fits-all 1.75 spaces per unit. We think there needs to be some flexibility there. Another one of is permitting permit platting by right. That goes into we're trying to streamline the process. We think there ought to be, and one of the things we brought up was there should be a representative with the municipality that helps these people come through and helps them walk them through the process. Oftentimes when people come in, they have a desire, they want to see attainable housing, they don't know where to start. And a lot of the people are very unsophisticated, they're very intimidated by the process. So if there was somebody there with the municipality that could help walk them through the process, help them understand the paperwork, the steps that are involved, streamline that process, make it affordable, make it attractive to people to want to do this kind of development. We think that's obviously very advantageous and would be encouraging more development of this type in the community. Let's see here, what else we got in that category. Encouraging the uses of land trust. One of the things we talked about here is typically when we go in and we look at the overall cost of a development, upwards of 25 to 35% of the overall cost is attributable to land. If we can take that cost out of the equation, that's a substantial portion that gives that ultimate homeowner or that tenant relief in terms of the housing. So if we can do these developments that have the land trust and do the nonprofits to take away that 25 or 30% of that burden for that homeowner, that's obviously going to be very attractive in terms of retainership. Incentivizing attainable housing in target zones. One of the things we talked about, everybody's probably heard of the different zones that they have for redevelopment. We think that every municipality ought to have the flexibility to go in and look at areas of their communities and say, this area is targeted for redevelopment. We want to encourage people to come in, to think outside the box, to redevelopment, to invest in these communities, and it shouldn't be a one-size-fits-all. Again, we look here in Central Florida, there's plenty of opportunities we have. Look at the Pine Hills area. Wonderful little community that was established 40, 45 years ago. There ought to be opportunities to go in there, and we ought to have designated areas where we're focusing, we're taking our resources, we're taking our personnel, and we're making this a point that we want to bring it to the attention, bring it to the forefront, and open up the discussion with people and encourage that kind of development in those types of areas.
Thank you.
Okay. What are we talking about next?
I have to get the slides to work in order to figure that out. There we go. Corporate engagement.
That would be me. Can you hear me? I'm not sure this isn't working.
The battery died on that one, maybe? Probably, I don't know. Yeah, I noticed.
It's working, it's working. You can hear me.
Oh, it's still working? Good. So, we are fortunate to live in a place that's creating jobs at a rapid pace. Very blessed as a community to have that. And, you know, the discussions that we had, particularly given the participants in the panel, is that, you know, where we are trying to address it tends to be down at the downstream at the end when the builder's building, pulling a building permit, and the individual or a family is purchasing a home. And what we're starting to see across the U.S. with this attainable housing issue is that the organizations that are creating those jobs that we recruit and we want to have create jobs to have a prosperous community, they're starting to get engaged in this because they're seeing, particularly after the Great Recession, some of us in the business call it depression, through those tough years, there is a shortfall of housing being delivered in these price points where, frankly, these middle class jobs, workforce housing needs are there. You know, just to highlight a few of those are organizations like Microsoft that within the last year committed $500 million to housing challenges in their area, Seattle, where a lot of their jobs are located. Google, kind of similar markets out on the West Coast, dedicated $1 billion to try to work on solutions for this. Amazon recently announcing contributions not only from the corporate level but from the founder, Jeff Bezos. You look in healthcare, which for years has struggled with recruitment in a lot of these urban centers where it's difficult to find housing nearby, particularly with the kind of hours that healthcare professionals have to keep on a 24/7, 365 basis. And Kaiser Permanente, United Healthcare, each one of those have been contributing $200 million, $250 million to start trying to work with community organizations, civic organizations to encourage this attainable housing effort that's underway. So with that kind of groundswell and recognition by corporations that they've got to engage in this, our biggest recommendation is the top point on here is that we want to try to create for Central Florida, call it a task force, call it a round table, you know, better labels might be able to, you might be able to come up with. But the idea is that we engage our anchor kind of employers in Central Florida to start the dialogue on this. As Tiffany said, to try to get ahead of it as opposed to trying to fix it later, a decade from now or something. So as a part of that exercise, if we can establish this roundtable, this task force to focus on it, we know there's a lot of great examples already occurring across the U.S. I've never been shy that we go steal great planning ideas when we're designing our master plan communities. A lot of these paths have already been taken. There's already lessons learned in it. In fact, I'll do a little commercial for one of the participant speakers that was here yesterday from NYU's Furman School that has created a website called localhousingsolutions.org. And if you haven't ever seen it and you're focused on affordable and attainable housing, it is an incredible resource of research of things that are already being done across the country, all indexed in a way that's easy to dive into and look at what others are doing so you can save time to get focused on solutions as opposed to all the research side of it. We believe we need to do the same thing on the attainable housing topic, is we need to benchmark these companies and these communities that are already partnering to try to address the needs of their workforce that are helping and fueling their companies' growth. We also want to take a moment and highlight that Orlando has already got some good examples of how partnering can work on these things. 30 years ago, I moved to Orlando. I went to work for Walt Disney Company, specifically Disney Development Company, and my very first project was a college intern housing project. Some of you may be aware of it, some of you may have stayed in it, looking at the ages of the faces around here. It's called Vista Way. And it was a program that Disney knew they had to have because a lot of their seasonal employment would come in only for a semester or 3 months or 6 months. And you talk about it's difficult to rent at affordable rates in this area. It's even more difficult to get short-term rentals like that. And so Disney had to step up 3 decades ago to start to provide affordable housing and attainable housing for their temporary employees. Well, if you track what they've done over the last few decades, and I'm not a Disney employee anymore, I'm not, touting my employer, but they've continued to ramp up those situations, partnering with developers where Disney's not developing the units, but they may step in as a master tenant and a master lessee so that they can have the kind of flexibility they need and the price points they need for their workforce out there. Another close by example that I'd highlight is Advent Health and what they did partnering with Craig Usler on the Healthy Village. And what I like particularly about that is, one, it was on land that Florida Hospital back in the day acquired to think about future expansion, but along the way they realized if they were going to recruit the best talent for nursing and physicians, they needed to have attainable housing within easy striking distance of their main campus. And the best of all is this one is located on a major transportation hub as well, with certainly being near I-4, but also on the rail line, the Sunrail. So a good TOD example that was done by them. And we got a case study presented yesterday on the Orlando Neighborhood Improvement Corporation teaming up with Hughes Supply to keep those jobs and collaborate with them on, certainly Hughes' involvement with that organization enhanced that opportunity so that it could happen.
Charles, I have a quick question. Sorry.
Okay.
So when you're talking about our corporate leadership and corporate partners, did you all discuss and then reject an idea of a linkage fee or a fee in lieu for commercial development?
Yeah, in fact, it was discussed, and our leader here had us consolidate, what we're able to share just in this portion, but it is something that other communities are doing, and we'd have to figure out if that's the right solution for this area, because what you're balancing is all the efforts we go to recruit businesses, sometimes through tax abatement, things like that, to get them here. And I think we would, in general, want to be cautious when we start talking about fees, charging for a company who's investing to grow business in their area. And that's why I think it should be considered, but I think there's a lot of others. Some of these investments that I was rattling off of, like with Amazon, their investments for housing issues are going into existing community housing, some not-for-profits, some or the other organizations. Sometimes they're playing a Disney kind of role where they're guaranteeing a development in terms of the financing so that it can happen. Sometimes they're actually even playing the builder, developer, owner, operator, you know, of those. So we want a lot of arrows in our quiver, and I think the benefit of pulling in a roundtable with our business leadership in Central Florida, we can start to have a dialogue about all the options and which are the ones we want to make the priorities with. Not trying to avoid the question, but it was discussed, and there was a healthy debate. There were some that think that might be a good way to go, particularly for smaller businesses that can't build a 200-unit place. But on the other hand, we want to keep the prosperity going and not discourage companies from bringing their jobs here. The last bullet point up here really speaks to what we see as a mismatch today of what our builder-developer community is delivering, which tends to be the old 3 to 4 bedroom, 2.5 bath, designed for, you know, married couple with, you know, 2.3 children. Well, that's the minority today of our demographic. But this is one of those systemic things. It's not just the builder saying that's what I need. It's the brokers who say, you need to think about resale. And the next person buying might not be a single parent like you, only needing 2 bedrooms. We think that companies can start to get more involved in partnering with builder developers to say, hey, this is the specific needs of our workforce. We'll help underwrite some of the risks that you perceive by doing what I call built for the demographic, so that they may do more 2 bedrooms, so they can do 1-car garages, which to a lot of brokers and builders today, they're nervous. And frankly, some of them just lack the courage to step out and produce that product. But we think that ultimately building smaller homes is one of the biggest ways to make a dent in the attainable housing. If you take some of the statistics, you see over the last several years that we just keep building bigger and bigger houses, even though the average household size keeps decreasing over that. That's part of the reason we're in this challenge today with attainable housing. So that wraps up, you know, our group.
Next. My clicker stopped working, so.
Pretend I clicked.
Oh, there we go.
There you go.
That's your mic.
There you
Just put that on your lapel.
I wonder I couldn't find it. All right. We focused on what sort of design considerations we need to make in order to advance this agenda, and we thought it'd be very helpful to think in terms of a specific goal. So as Tiffany pointed out in her presentation, when we look at the need, the annual need for housing of households in that 80 to 120 area median income price range, there's a need for about 1,700 units a year. And then as she said, when we expand that to look at up to 150% of area median income, there's about 2,500 units a year. The greater deficit is at the lower end of that range, but we're under supplying the market. And so when we look at that, so if you sort of take a midpoint and say, you know, it's a couple thousand to 2,500 units a year, you know, setting a goal of around 20,000 units over the next 10 years is a very reasonable and we think achievable goal for you know, creating more inventory of attainably priced housing. We thought one way that the county could go about helping to make that happen within Orange County would be to come up with some ideas of the kinds of housing that are desirable, and to create a pattern book, like a lot of developers do in their community when they're trying to explain to builders what they want to have happen in their community. To do the same thing at the county level and think about what kinds of design ideas would be desirable and would actually receive some incentives, perhaps in the form of impact fee credits or expedited permitting and other kinds of incentives like that. So to create that sort of a pattern book. And we had, as part of the work that unfortunately, we don't get to share all the great discussions that we had the last couple of days, but one of the things we did was we had a design team looked at 3 sort of representative sites across the county, a couple of infill and one more suburban location. And we had several different architects and planners involved in looking at the different kinds of things that could happen there. And it was so creative. It almost is the beginning of this pattern book, if you will. We look at the ideas of what could happen that could help us address that deficit of attainable housing. And then we sort of compared the ideas that came up of what could happen with what we actually see getting built. And as several people have already commented today, when we look at the range of housing products that are being supplied to the market as compared to where the demand is and what consumers tell us that they would like to see, we see a disconnect. And so we think that's a really helpful way of addressing that disconnect. We looked at some information that showed the mix of housing product types between single family and townhomes and other kinds of attached for sale housing that we were building 10 years ago, and compared that with what we're building now, and didn't see a lot of difference. And as several people, Charles just commented on the fact that the kinds of households out there have changed a lot, and the mix of housing hasn't changed. And so this next recommendation, encouraging small lot, single family infill, townhomes and other attached product in areas with good transportation access and proximity to employment. What we seem to see happening on the industry side and sometimes on the regulatory side is this idea that we'll address affordable housing, we'll continue with this drive until you qualify sort of approach, and people will spend a lot more on transportation as a trade-off for the fact that they can't afford to live closer in. And the assumption is we'll build really sort of bare bones quote, value housing at the edge. And then we go and ask consumers, is this what you want? And they say, actually, we would be satisfied with a much smaller house, smaller than what we can find in the market, if you can put it in a place where it's close to where we have to drop off our kids for school in the morning, and closer to our jobs, and closer to shopping and services. We'll sacrifice the square footage. And as Charles said, what we've seen when we look at the data is that the home sizes have been going up and up. The share of smaller housing units that we've been building has really shrunk, particularly since the Great Recession. It's gone down quite a bit. And when we look out across the country at other places where this is being addressed, we see new home sizes in the 900 to 1,600 square foot range really being picked up very quickly by the market. By in Tiffany's slide, she showed the young couples and singles and the small families and the young families who are looking for that kind of product. Especially if we can put it in places where they want to live, where the location is the amenity, they'll sacrifice the square footage. And we don't see a lot of that happening in some of the places where we do see value housing happening in Orange County. It does tend to be at the edge. It does tend to be bigger. Some of it gets down to the 1,600 to 1,800 square foot range, but really we see an opportunity for a lot smaller and higher density housing. It's smaller square footage, it's higher density, it's still quality housing, and there's a ready market for it. The other thing that we wanted to say as a recommendation was to really discourage both the explicit and the implicit inclusionary zoning. And what we mean by that are places of where, because of the zoning or because of the particular development agreement, that there's a decision that's been made that we're going to have a minimum lot size here, or a minimum square footage in an area. And what that does is just drive the price of the housing up, and it says that we're going to have a community where only people who can afford a certain size of house. When we sell houses by the square foot, you make the square footage bigger, the house is more expensive, and so we're keeping people out of certain communities. And as Tiffany pointed out at the outset of our conversation, there are a lot of people who need that housing. And even sometimes where it's not explicitly exclusionary, when you go in with a more creative kind of innovative housing solution, perhaps a higher density solution or more compact detached single family infill kind of development, that it's tough to get through those planning commission hearings and get that approved. And so that's what we mean by implicit exclusionary zoning. So those are our design recommendations. Ken?
Great. Thank you. So, before I go through these, I just want to remind everybody that these guys weren't that happy with me because I made them only do 4. They all had a laundry list. There was a lot of great thinking that went into this. And so the final report will have more than what you're hearing today. But the other thing we wanted to do for you as part of this really intense approach is to pull out the top 5 that collectively this entire group of experts thought you really ought to pay the most attention to, at least initially. And so these are a repeat of some of the things you've already heard, but promoting, creating, and retaining the attainable housing around the transit stops and employment centers. You heard that a couple of different times probably. Secondly, looking at those regulations and those regulatory policies and the actual wording of the regulations themselves, adjusting those so that you're encouraging attainable housing. Third, this idea of corporate leadership, or what I call civic leadership, which is both anchor institutions and business leaders, stepping up, creating this task force around this issue because it's important to them as they try to grow their enterprise. They need places for their employees in this price range, in this income range, to find good places to live, or else they're not going to have those employees in order to grow their enterprises. Certainly encouraging that residential design innovation that creates those 20,000 units in 10 years, very important. There's a lot of good design solution that was discussed by this group. And so getting after that and creating some consensus about what that means in practice, it would be really important. And as part of that, that pattern book idea is really one that the group really came up with. And by the way, they didn't want me to limit them to 5 either on this. And so there's a lot of great ideas that have come out of this group. I think that there's a commitment for people to stay engaged. There's a commitment for people to want to continue this conversation going forward, both in terms of ULI, but also in terms of the broader community. And there's an interest in from ULI in being part of this broader conversation. So this final report, as Scott mentioned earlier, will be available probably before the 6 weeks, so that's one of our next action steps. But there's this other action plan that we think you really need to think about as you're moving forward here. You're engaged. You can get out there and recruit those corporate leaders and those civic leaders, maybe even a little bit more, and actually create a plan around attainable housing. And this is unusual. I congratulated you earlier on it, but you've got the spotlight right now. Actually sit down and create an action plan to get after this. We'll see the ULI members participating in those broader public discussions, and I think they're probably even going to organize themselves in a way that makes that easier to do. And then finally, there's a potential as an immediate action step to create other work products other than the TAP report that will help you as part of this discussion. It'll help you as you're even considering new projects in a variety of communities around Orlando to help you really move this conversation forward and have some tools available to you to do this. And the last thing I'll mention, and this was supposed to get on the next step slide and it didn't make it, but one of the things that came up as part of our discussion is the fact that this is the Urban Land Institute, and the Urban Land Institute is the private development community. And one of the things we know we need to do next is to sit down and make sure that from a financial standpoint, which is what drives a lot of the decision making, that what we're suggesting to you, and we think our instincts are that this does work, but what we're suggesting to you that we can have the discussion that says, yes, developers, builders, others, yes, you can make money developing attainable housing in the Orlando market. In fact, in terms of return on investment, it's just as good as building the luxury stuff and the big stuff that you've been building. And so we did some very preliminary discussions around that, but that's clearly one of the next steps that we want to get after. All right? Oh, I thought we had a final slide. Maybe that was the last slide. With that, we are happy, we're a little bit over time, and thank you for your patience with us today. We're happy to take questions for the panel. And Scott, I don't know if you had any other final comments or not? Okay. Any additional questions? Yes, sir.
I've got a suggestion. For home ownership, having land in a land trust doesn't give the homeowner the homestead exemption for tax purposes. And what I'm going to recommend and circulate is a subordinated second mortgage approach to affordable housing or attainable housing that allows the homeowner to buy the lot but not have to pay for it unless they lose their homestead exemption.
Good point, and there are a bunch of different ways to solve that issue. You're right about that. Yes, ma'am.
One of the panelists talked about attainable housing and local government incentives and reduced impact fees and that sort of thing. From a developer's perspective, what sort of assurances or commitments could a developer make on the other end so that a local government who's potentially giving up money for parks or schools or whatever else knows that that unit is sold at an attainable rate, or kind of how does that other end work? That's one of the struggles that we've had, is that we like all those incentives, but enforcement doesn't sound like a fun job for a local government to check all of the incomes of all the people moving in, or what, from a development perspective, is there a way to address that?
I'm not sure if that came up in our discussions or not, Jeff?
I can jump in. One of the things it did was, we talked about that, and how do you limit that home buyer or that resident from not flipping that home and essentially capturing those values, those savings, if you will, on the back end. And that's a real challenge. Do you do that by some type of a deed restriction or some type of something on the mortgage that allows them to take advantage of those savings, those lesser savings? But that's clearly a challenge. We think the biggest factor is the front end and getting these residents into these homes. And if you have an impact fee based on a per square foot rather than just a per unit basis, a lot of times the biggest hurdle for these is the down payment and getting into these homes on the front end. And if you have impact fees $10,000, $12,000, $15,000 or more in some communities, that's quite a bit when you're asked to put down 20%. But it's clearly a challenge. We recognize that, and we certainly don't want the communities to have to go in and keep continuously policing these things. So we recognize that's.
But even to one of your earlier comments, you talked about not levying those impact fees until occupancy. At occupancy, you're going to know what that unit sold for, and so it's not a monitoring. It's not an enforcement and monitoring function. It's just, okay, here's the contract, here's the closing doc. Now that impact fee is X because it's clearly an unattainable price point. So I think there are probably some ways for you to get to that so it's not an administrative burden.
And to piggyback on that, the time value of money, if you will, between when those typically those impact fees are paid at building permit. If it's a large community that's 200 or 300 units per se, that may take 18, 24 months to bring to fruition. And the carry on those fees for that period of time before those impacts to the community for the transportation, the schools, the water, the sewer are ever realized is a tremendous financial burden that has to be borne ultimately by the resident. It's just part of the development cost. So if we can prolong the payment of those, then we've lessened the burden on the front end in terms of financial return and able to share that with the ultimate resident, buyer and occupant.
Any other thoughts from the panel on that?
One more.
Okay, go ahead.
One more comment. Housing for All is looking at a series of different tools for a specific action plan implementation. One of the most transformational ones at the top of a pyramid, if you think of a framework, is was inclusionary zoning. With House Bill 7103, it's making it a lot more unpredictable and difficult for us to continue to have that conversation in an engaged format with the participants. What I like about today and the takeaway in terms of one of the last ideas and recommendations here is your discourage explicit as well as implicit exclusionary zoning. So this is like the other side of the implementation side of it, exclusionary being discouraged. The only change that I would make to that particular recommendation is for us, the local governments, as well as the municipalities participating in this whole process, is that we should change that word of discouraged. We're looking at very focused, targeted areas where affordable housing makes sense, very context-sensitive approach. We should change that word of discouragement to prohibit. That's the predictable side. We continue to discourage. This is the new normal, I think. I think the new normal for diverse, thriving, vibrant communities is to have mixed income as part of that.
Just me.
Ken, to follow up, and I'm on Alberto's committee, but one of the big discussions we've been having, and Elizabeth, the city floated it about 18 months ago in the development community. We all lost our minds over the inclusionary zoning. But was there a conversation? I mean, I think the local governments are saying, okay, I get it, Becky. Your client doesn't want one affordable unit for one market rate unit. But is there a tipping point? If Jeff can get 25 extra market rate units for one attainable or one workforce, where is that sliding scale? And I just didn't know if you guys had discussed that.
So we did talk about inclusionary zoning and it's certainly worth a further conversation as we go forward. We thought it would be sort of, if we talk about inclusionary zoning, but sort of ignored the fact that we have this both explicit and implicit exclusionary zoning going on right now, which has a huge impact on and potentially a bigger impact than what we might accomplish through inclusionary zoning. That we thought that I think suggesting that it's prohibited as opposed to discouraged is a good consideration. We kind of landed on the side of it. If on the one hand we're saying we're going to add a few more units by the inclusionary zoning, but meanwhile most of our development practices are saying we're going to really segregate who lives where by our exclusionary zoning practices, it's probably not going to have as big an impact. So that's why we landed on the.
And part of that conversation was around how do we actually get to scale on these solutions, right? And regulations often take a really long time to get any kind of scale around them. So as ULI, I mean, honestly, our instinct is always, how can we make market adjustments so that the market takes over and begins to get after the solutions that we think make market sense. And so I think that's kind of what the team went after. Yeah, Dean.
Yeah, I was just going to add, embedded in some of the recommendations that Jeff gave was that anybody who's looking for a rezoning on property or looking for density bonuses, there will be a quid pro quo that with that density or change in zoning that it gives more units, that those units will also be assumed to be attainable. They're probably smaller so that they can be attainable.
Other questions? I mean, again, we know that this was a day and a half of really good, hard work and thinking, but we also know that the conversation is going to continue. We're suggesting that you continue it and maybe even elevate it more than you have, and you've done a great job of elevating it already. Engaging that business leadership we think is critically important. Getting after these design features, simply setting the goal, as Greg pointed out, is a great way to move the dial and to move yourselves forward. And I think with that, we're 15 minutes over, so I'm going to call it a wrap on this. Thank you again for coming. Thank you again to the panelists for spending their time doing all this. And please understand that ULI did not have to step up and do this. This shows great leadership coming out of the real estate industry and the leaders in that real estate industry, and this is what ULI is best at. So please appreciate the fact that they've done this. It really took some courage to pull this team together and do it. So thank you again for coming. I'm sure the panelists will stick around if you have individual questions for them in the next little while. And thank you again for taking time to come out and hear what we had to say. Nice job.